Okay, so here we are working on step 8 with example number 5. Evaluate argument in natural language without jargon, taking a stance on the quality of the argument and then backing that stance up, trying to persuade my reader that my evaluation of the argument is accurate. And I always start with some pre-writing. Some of these points make sense. So, for example, interest rates are at historic lows, for example. But it's not true that real estate always appreciates. Also, impressing your mom is not a good reason to make such an important decision. Maybe most importantly, lots of points aren't mentioned here that should be taken into account. How much money does the person earn? What are their future plans, etc.? More strengths than weaknesses. More weaknesses than strengths. Alright, let's start writing evaluation. So in my pre-writing, I'm like, okay, there's some good points, but there's a lot of problems. I don't think it's going to succeed. But I want to point out that it makes at least one that I came up with good point, and another one that may be somewhat important but not. So, at least it makes the good point about interest rates. Those are definitely low. And it may be true that the mom would be impressed, but I'm going to question its relevance. So I'm going to say, although this argument includes some reasonable points, its flaws ultimately outweigh its strengths. The author is how do I put this? The author is correct to point out how low interest rates have become. In fact, they are at historic lows, which makes purchasing a house much more affordable than at other times. But the author is not correct when she or he says that real estate always appreciates. In fact, although the real estate market is quite mixed, depending on location, there have been plenty of cities and towns where where the value of real estate has plummeted in the past decade. So what I'm doing there without using the words is I'm questioning the acceptability of that claim and giving some evidence that it's not quite right. So the author is correct to point out how low interest rates are, but not correct that it's also questionable whether one should make such a far-reaching and important decision as buying a house on the basis of impressing one's parents. It's not at all clear that you can predict whether an action would impress one's parents. Ugh, too many ones. Would impress your... I want to switch from one to your. One is a little arch. It's a little formal. And I'm going to go back and do that too. But even if you could, that's not a good reason to take on debt that you can't handle, debt or other responsibilities. And that brings up another major flaw in this argument, which is that it doesn't address some really important points that should be considered before buying a house, such as one's income level, job security, and predictability of future plans. All in all, the evidence presented here is just not convincing. So let me look over that. This is an evaluation up here. Remember, it's an important part. I have to take a stand. Its flaws ultimately outweigh its strengths. So that's another way of saying that it's not persuasive. And I come back and reiterate that point here. So I've done the first thing I need to do with step A, which is I've taken a position. And then the rest of the evaluation backs up that position. I'm just going to read it through to see if I want to correct it or neaten it up a little bit. I notice I use in fact twice. I'm going to take that out. Notice how I go a step. I don't just say it's also a question whether you should do that. I go a step further and say, well, you can't predict it, but even if you could, that's not a good reason to take on debt or other responsibilities. So I back that up a little bit, develop that a little bit. This is right here. In this sentence right here, I'm really dealing with the criteria of sufficiency without using that term. Okay, which I'm mentioning what the argument doesn't talk about. And I not only say it doesn't talk about it, but I say these are some really important points. I could have developed that even further, but the point is that these are central things that really ought to be considered. Good. I think that's a good evaluation.